Welcome to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, the show that's about all kinds of fuel for all kinds of people. I'm your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I'll be your guide through the ever-changing world of fuel. Here at the Fuel Pulse Show podcast, we talk about all kinds of fuel for all kinds of people, and that means we talk both about all the issues you tend to find when you're using or managing all the different kinds of fuel out there, and we also talk about all the problems and the issues related to all the things that use those fuels: cars, trucks, generators, backup emergency systems, that kind of thing, which means, indeed, the Fuel Pulse Show podcast is for everyone. And so what are we going to talk about today? Well, this is going to be our third episode in the series on what we call microbial myths. The half-truths, the myths, and the misconceptions in the fuel world about microbes, microbial contamination, and what to do about those problems. Now, in past episodes, we talked about the microbial myth that getting rid of water or keeping water away will make microbial problems disappear. And we talked about the microbial myth that microbes can't grow or really cause problems in cold weather. So today, we're focusing on a third microbial myth, and it's one that is passed around by people offering solutions to microbial contamination situations. But it's one that if you didn't know any better, you might get sucked in by it. And if you did, you'd end up not actually solving the problem that you really need a solution for. Now, many times in past episodes, we have talked about the prevalence of microbial contamination problems developing in today's stored fuels. And we talked about the reasons why we're seeing a lot more of that. Those reasons stem first from the change in today's fuel's composition. You have ultra-low sulfur diesel fuel, and not only that, but that ULSD also has low but pretty ubiquitous concentrations of biodiesel in it. The ULSD itself, because of the way it's been processed, it has less aromatic content, which means it has less resistance to microbial growth. And when you combine that with that little bit of biodiesel that's always present, that creates fuel that attracts more water. It's more hygroscopic, as they say, and that only increases the potential for microbial contamination. Now, because microbial contamination is so common these days, there's no shortage of people out there offering solutions to fix the problems that this contamination entails. So today's fuels require better care than they used to, and those people, those fuel polishers, are doing a pretty brisk business these days. And why shouldn't they? I mean, at its core, fuel polishing and fuel filtration can be a key component of good stored fuel maintenance. We mentioned before on this podcast the idea that best practice fuel management or fuel maintenance for today's fuels really needs to be a three-pronged approach that we have termed the hybrid approach. And the three prongs being testing, chemical treatment, and mechanical processing. Now, you use the right fuel testing to give you both the benefit of a clearly defined problem and give you a window into whether anything that you've done about it has actually solved your problem. You use the right problem-solving chemistries for what you need to do in that fuel, including, in many cases, biocides and stabilizers are key components of that. The third prong of the hybrid approach is where fuel polishing fits in, and that's the mechanical element of fuel care. There are certain things that good fuel chemistries are essential to doing that the other prongs of the approach can't do. The same can be said for the mechanical elements of the approach, and that is indeed where fuel polishing comes in. Fuel polishing is the common name for fuel filtration. Now, sometime later on, and maybe in a later episode, we may have a fuel polisher here on the show to talk about what they do and what difference their processes make. But at its heart, fuel polishing and the mechanical element of the hybrid approach, They do things that even good fuel chemistries can't do. They remove contaminants from the fuel primarily through filtration. Now, there are a lot of fuel polishers out there. It is a relatively crowded market. Some polishers are parts of bigger full service companies that have a lot of resources and they have a lot of expertise backing up what they do. Some of the other polishers are smaller operations. And they still know what they're doing, though. Don't get us wrong. There's nothing wrong with being a smaller operation. And we're certainly not going to say that any of these small polishers should be expected to do a bad job. There are lots of smaller fuel polishing operations that do high quality, high caliber work. And being small, being a small company, a small fuel polisher, can in some cases offer some advantages, like they allow you to be more flexible and to pay more attention to detail. But there's one microbial myth that we want to talk about that unfortunately you often find when you're dealing with fuel polishers. That microbial myth is the claim that a fuel polisher or a fuel filtration process can polish out, filter out microbes. So that's what we want to talk about today. The claim made by some in the industry that they have a filtration solution or a filtration process that's so good, it gets rid of microbial problems simply by filtering them out, such that you don't need to do some of the conventional things that you were seeing you needed to do to solve your contamination problem, like use biocides. So, to frame this up, let's take a scenario. Those of you who have used or done business with fuel polishers before, tell me if this kind of thing ever happened to you. So you got stored fuel and you're having issues with it. You're pretty sure that the signs that you've seen are pointing to the fact that you've got a microbial contamination situation in your system. So you bring in a fuel polisher for a consultation, see what they have to say about it. And they confirm, yes, you need fuel polishing because you've got some water in the tank that needs removing. That's valid. You've got sludge and sediment in the fuel that needs to come out. That's valid too. And of course, they can get that done. They can get rid of the water. They can filter out the contaminants and filter your fuel down to 5 microns or whatever that means. And of course, the assumption is that resolving the microbial contamination that you've got is going to go along with all that. And then somehow the subject comes up about, well, whatever chemicals they're going to be using in their process. You think you have microbial contamination. Maybe they agree with you that you do have one. So you ask, well, what biocide chemistry are you going to use? How much are you going to use in my project? And that's when they say, we don't have to use biocides because all you have to do is polish out the microbes and the problem's gone. Okay. Others have encountered that kind of myth or that version of the myth in at times when they are in, let's say, less desirable circumstances. They have contaminated fuel that's causing a problem and they need to get it solved. They need to get it resolved right now. And so they hired a fuel polisher to fix that problem, to polish their fuel, get it back up to the condition that they needed it to be in. So the polisher came in, filtered the fuel, seemingly resolved their problem, right? The work's completed. The polisher's gone. They're gone on to the next situation. But then, not that long after they've left the job, the signs of microbial contamination have come back just the same as before they were called out. Now, when the customer questions the polisher, maybe then they ask, well, how much biocide did you use when you were working on my tank? And that's when that polisher might say, oh, we don't use biocides. We just polish the microbes out. Now, on the face of it, it really does not sound like the most implausible thing in the world. The job of the polishing or filtration process is to remove contaminants and remove particulate matter from the fuel. So it's not implausible to think that a claim that they can polish out microbes might actually be true, especially if the polisher talks about how good their polishing process is and how far down they polish the fuel to, which in itself is another matter for consideration. Maybe we'll talk about later. So when they talk like this and then they say, oh, we didn't use a biocide because you don't have to, we just polished the microbes out. Since you've entered into this job with the optimism that you made a good choice and they're going to solve the issue just like they promised, you may not have a reason to push back on that thing that they're telling you. And yet, there are several good reasons why this idea that microbes can be polished out or filtered out, such that biocides become unnecessary, there are several good reasons to consider why that concept just is not true, no matter how it might sound in theory. And this is important because what that fuel polisher is telling you isn't just untrue. It's so untrue, it's so problematic that using that rationale really has doomed the entire thing to failure before it even began. It's turned your whole, if they went into your project with that assumption and with the intention to use that assumption as part of their process, in other words, not intending to use biocides, they entered into your job with that intention of not using a biocide, it unfortunately, it really turns your entire project, your entire situation into money down the drain for you. And nobody likes a situation where they think that they've wasted money. So all of this sounds pretty serious, doesn't it? Well, let's talk about those reasons, the several good reasons why the idea that microbes can be polished out just is not true. So let's talk about those reasons so that you can see where we're coming from. The reasons why the idea that you can filter a microbe problem away just doesn't hold water. First, reason number one, microbes are smaller than you think, and filtration ratings don't mean what you might think. Now, it sounds good when they talk about how far down they're going to filter the fuel to. We filter the fuel down to 5 microns. They might say something like that. 5 microns sounds like a pretty small number. Then when they claim, so they make that claim, and then they talk about filtering microbes out. They've already got you thinking that they're going to be getting the really, really small stuff out. Now, microbes are small, right? So when they follow what that claim up with, yeah, we're just going to filter the microbes out, it's almost like that second assumption, the assumption that you can filter microbes out, it just flows naturally from the first one. We're going to get all the small stuff out. One flows into the other, and you tend to accept both of those things equally without the necessary critical judgment. So, some things to keep in mind about all this. First, a filter rate, when they talk about 5 microns, or they talk about using a 5 micron filter, a filter rating of 5 microns, that does not mean that all particles in the fuel that are 5 microns and bigger are going to get caught and removed by that filter. What a filter rating of 5 microns means is that 5 micron notation is actually the size of the smallest opening in the filter, which means it's the smallest size that filter is able to catch. What it doesn't mean is that the filter is going to catch 100% of all the particles 5 microns and up. Now, in order to answer that, in order to know how many of those small particles it's actually going to filter out, you don't just cite a 5 micron rating. What you need to know is you need to know what the beta rating of the filter is. Now, beta rating is a calculation used in the filtration industry. An important thing to note about beta rating, or one of the important things to note about beta rating, is that it's always specific to particle size. This filter has a beta rating of X at 10 microns. It has a beta rating of Y at 5 microns. Beta rating is specific to particle size, and what it does is it tells you how many particles of that particular size and up get caught or trapped by that filter going in versus going through. So I'll explain more about what that means in a minute so that you'll understand what I'm saying. Beta ratings go on an ascending scale, which means larger beta rating, more effective filtration. A 50 beta rating for a given particle size is better than a 20 beta rating for that same particle size. So a way to think about what beta rating means, what I was talking about a minute ago, is to think about for the number of particles of the size represented by that number going into the filter, one of those particles ends up making it through. So what I mean is, let's say you have a filter that has a beta rating of 10 for 5 microns. We keep saying 5 microns, so we'll just go with that. It's got a beta rating of 10 at 5 microns. What that means is that if you have 10 particles that are 5 microns and up, 10 particles of that size, 10 particles going into the filter, one of those particles makes it through, which means 10 minus 1, 10 minus 1 is 9. 9 out of the 10 particles were trapped by the filter, which means that filter that had a beta rating of 10 actually trapped 90% of the particles. Oh, and remember, again, we keep stressing this, it's particles of that size or larger. Beta ratings are always relative to particle size. So, beta rating of 10 means it's trapping 90%. Beta rating of 100 means 100 particles of a given size go into the filter, right? One of those particles makes it through, which means 99 of those particles were caught by the filter. Means the filter caught 99% of those particles. A beta rating of 40 particles at a certain size, 40 particles go in, 1 comes out, which means the filter caught 39 out of 40, 97.5%, and so on. That's what beta rating means. Now, a good fuel polisher, if you ask them, should be able to tell you the beta rating of the different filters that they're using. And when I say different filters, what I'm getting at is fuel polishers will always use a series of filters of differing sizes. They'll use a primary one, which sometimes it's a bag filter, but it is the one that they tend to use to catch the big particulate, including anything like rust that might be in the tank. That gets trapped by the primary filter. Then they have a secondary filter, which is for fine particulate. So it's going to have a better rating than that primary one. And then they'll also have coalescing filters to get out any entrained, suspended water, that kind of thing. A good fuel polisher should easily be able to tell you everything that you want to know about the performance ratings, including the beta rating, of all those filters that they're using. So now that you know all that, should be pretty clear that a simple proclamation of, well, we filter down to 5 microns doesn't actually tell you everything that you need to know. Now, let's take all that and link it back to this issue of the original question of filtering out microbes. Microbes, we have a number of different kinds of microbes that tend to be found in fuel systems. You have bacteria and fungi are kind of the two main families, if you will, and then lots of different species within those. But they're all different sizes, right? Because the question that we're looking at now is, how big is a microbe? A microbe, whenever you talk about the size of a microbe, you typically express it in that microns figure. A micron is actually a thousandth of a millimeter. And since there's 1,000 millimeters in a meter, that means a micron is actually a millionth of a meter. Now, the size of microns, depending on if they're bacteria or fungi, can range anywhere from 0.2 microns, a fifth of a micron, up to 2 microns, 5 microns. Some fungi even go up between 5 and 10 microns. Okay, but they're differing sizes. Now, if a filter that's being used by that fuel polisher that claims, I'm going to use this filter to filter your microbes out so I don't have to use biocide. That filter, if he says it's got a 5 micron rating, it should be fine. 5 micron rating, but you know that many, many species of bacteria and fungi are 1 or 2 microns in size. All those ones are not going to get caught by that filter because they're smaller than the smallest size hole that filter's got in it. So they're not going to be filtered out. And that is a problem for this whole we don't need to use biocides logic. Because if those microns are not removed, they're going to go back into that fuel system, back into that fuel tank. And then once everything has finished and the fuel polisher is gone, they're just going to stick around in there. They're going to multiply. They're going to reestablish that microbial contamination after the fuel polisher leaves. So that's problem number one. Microbes are too small to be effectively filtered out by the filters that the fuel polisher uses. Reason number one. Reason number two why there's a problem with that logic of not having these biocides deals with the fact that in order to adequately resolve a microbial contamination, you have to get the biofilms out. See, in a typical microbial contamination situation, it's not just the microbes aren't just floating around in the fuel. They're actually doing most of their activity, most of their living in a couple of different types of places than just the fuel. They'll typically be living in that biofilm, the floating biofilm that's at the interface between the fuel on top and the water on bottom, what they call the rag layer. There'll be lots of microbes in there. And then there will also be lots and lots, billions of microbes living in the biofilms that are all inside that tank attached to the solid surfaces, the inside walls, the baffles, the USTs, the different hard, solid surface components that are in that tank. Now, a good fuel polisher will remove water from the tank, and they're also going to try and remove by filtration all that rag layer that's in between the fuel and the water, right? But it's really hard to get all the biofilms from all of those different internal tank surfaces, especially if the tank designs involve compartments and baffles, as many tanks do these days. So that polisher can get all the rag layer they want out, but they're almost always going to leave some biofilms, some biomass behind. And that means that for whatever biofilms they leave behind, all those microbes that are left in there are just going to reestablish themselves again and reestablish the contamination problem after the job has been concluded. And that is why this idea that you can just filter microbes out and the contamination's gone, that idea is, from a practical standpoint, completely false. All you're really doing if you're using that logic is you're removing a percentage of the microbes and then leaving all the rest behind. And that is also why the idea that you don't have to use biocides to resolve a contamination problem is completely false as well. A biocide is the only thing that will actually kill microbes. Filtering out the microbes but leaving some of them behind only means that the microbes are going to come back later. And to be honest, good fuel polishers, reputable fuel polishers, they don't debate the importance of biocides. They don't debate it because they know that the role of biocides in resolving microbial contamination is not a point of serious debate within the industry. It's just not. To solve a microbial contamination problem, yes, you have to do certain things like remove that free water. You absolutely need to do that. You have to remove as much biofilm as possible. You absolutely need to do that. But the biggest thing, the single element that is most important in all of this, is you have to kill the microbes. And biocide treatments are the only thing that will actually do that. And any good fuel polisher is not going to dispute this because they can't dispute it. They know that it's true. And so that is why when you ask your fuel polisher what biocide that they used to knock out the microbial contamination, that is why a good fuel polisher is not going to respond with, oh, you don't need to do that. We just filter the microbes out. Now, ideally, you should discuss with your fuel polisher before the job which chemistry biocide they're going to be using and how much and how they're going to apply it. Whatever biocide they use needs to be properly registered, needs to have and that means it needs to have EPA registration number and establishment number clearly listed on its label as it is legally required to do. Now, a little bit about that. There are some polishers that try to get away with using unregistered products in the biocide role. Now, for one of those polishers that does that, at best, they're charging you for something that's not actually going to work, because if it's not registered as a biocide, it's highly likely that it doesn't actually kill anything. So at best, you're going to be ended up just throwing money away, essentially, being charged for something that isn't going to work. At worst, though, that fuel polisher is actually breaking the law. And depending on the situation, depending on who uses your fuel and in what capacity, they could be placing liability risk on your shoulders because they're putting an unregulated, unregistered additive into your fuel, and they're not doing anything about the problem, and then it's very possible that you could be spreading that problem onto other people, which could affect their equipment, could cause problems in a critical situation, and you don't want that. So all that to say, you don't want to use or do business with a polisher that makes the claim they don't have to use biocides, or if they do say they use a biocide, they don't actually use a properly registered and approved one. They use some I don't know, something that somebody formulated in their garage that just talks about how it inhibits microbial growth, but isn't actually registered as a biocide. If you're coming across a fuel polisher that fits any of those criteria, you should treat those as red flags and absolutely seek out somebody else. So, of all the legitimate biocides out there, the registered biocides, the one thing that they all have in common is they all kill microbes. They actually do kill microbes. They have to kill microbes in order to receive a biocide registration. So that's the one thing they have all in common, is they all kill microbes in some form or fashion or in some situation. However, saying that doesn't mean that all these biocides are equally good. And there are plenty of resources out there that you can consult that will help you make good decisions, become more educated on which biocides are good, which ones are not so good, in which situations. All information that should be helpful to you so that you can make the best decision for you on which biocide you want your fuel polisher to use. These kinds of resources typically will talk about how effective certain biocide chemistries are against different kinds of microbes commonly found in the fuel storage systems that you have, how long those biocides keep killing for, whether they add extra sulfur to the system or not. Even some biocides may, in addition to killing microbial contamination, they will bring added benefits as well, like dedicated corrosion protection for tank surfaces. So if you're a person who's having to make this kind of decision, if you're in charge of managing stored fuel resources, the fact that there are those kind of resources out there is good news and might be worth your while to check them out. And so, in conclusion for this episode, we said that fuel polishers offer a lot of good value for their customers, and they do some essential things in helping their customers take care of their stored fuel. They'll remove water, they take out particulate. Those two things are important things for keeping stored fuel healthy. But we also pointed out that not all fuel polishers are equally good. Some of them do try to take shortcuts by not incorporating the right chemicals into their system. And some of them even claim that they can resolve microbial contamination without using a biocide. And we found that claim to be false for several reasons. It's really hard to get all the biomass out that you need to. Microbes are too small to be filtered out all by themselves. And it's well proven over the years that the only way to solve a microbe problem is to kill the microbes first and then filter the dead microbes and their biofilms out. The only thing that will kill microbes is not getting rid of water, not filtering them out. The only thing that will kill microbes is applying an approved biocide chemistry in the right amount and in the proper way in the fuel. So that, my friends, is microbe myth number 3 busted. Good fuel polishers embrace the use of biocides to solve their customers' microbe problems because good fuel polishers know biocides do actually work. Good fuel polishers, the kind you should be doing business with, they don't use shortcuts around this fact with bogus claims about being able to get rid of microbial problems by filtering the microbes out. And so that's going to do it for this episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. As always, look for links to things we talked about in the show notes. If you liked what you heard, feel free to subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast at your favorite podcast purveyor or platform, whether it's iTunes, Amazon Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify. I myself like to use an application called Podcast Addict, but whichever is your preference, if you haven't already, please subscribe to the Fuel Pulse Show podcast. Also, it could also help us if you would give us a rating at your podcast platform, as that really helps with the algorithms and helps us become more visible to more of the people who might like content like this. So, once again, thank you for joining me today. I've been your host, Eric Bjornstad, and I will see you next time for the next episode of the Fuel Pulse Show podcast.